Section 23 of Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 6, by Agnes and Elisabeth Strickland. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Elisabeth, Chapter 6, Part 4. Early in February 1571, the repugnance of young Anjou assumed a graver and sterner form, and finding that his ill-mannered railing against the royal bride, who had been provided for him, was only regarded by his mother as a boyish petulance, he appealed to the king his brother against the marriage on such startling grounds that the wily queen mother, deeming it useless to proceed further with the negotiation in his name, wrote an agitated letter to Monsieur de la Mothe, informing him of the contumacy of Henry and imploring him to do his best to prevail on the Queen of England to accept his younger brother, the Duke of Alençon, in his place. After telling the ambassador that she would not confide the purport of what she is about to write to any other hand than her own, she says, "I assure myself that you will conduct this affair so secretly and dexterously that we shall not incur the danger I apprehend if the Queen of England, thinking herself disdained or scorned, should avenge herself by making war upon us, either openly or underhand, as she has done before now. To come to the point, my son, Anjou, has let me know, by the king his brother, that he will never marry the Queen of England, even if she be ever so willing to have him. So much has he heard against her honour, and seen in the letters of all the ambassadors who have ever been there in England, that he considers he should be utterly dishonoured, and lose all the reputation he has acquired. But still, hoping to make him yield to reason, I would wish you to continue to write in the same strain as at present, till I can decide what to do, letting the affair proceed, lest she should bear us ill will, and feel resentment at being refused. I declare to you that if she expresses a willing mind, I shall feel extreme concern at the opinion he has taken. I would give half my life blood out of my body could I alter it, but I cannot render him obedient in this matter. Now, Monsieur de la Mothe, continues the royal maternal speculator, we are on the point of losing such a kingdom and grandeur for my children that I shall feel great regret. See if there be no means, as I formerly asked you, of inducing her to adopt one of her female relatives as her heiress, whom one of my sons could espouse." The ignorance betrayed by Catherine de Medicis in this modest suggestion is scarcely less laughable than her absurd egotism, since, if Elizabeth could have been guilty of the folly of involving her realm in a succession war, for the sake of thus aggrandizing one of the cadet princes of France, there was no surviving marriageable lady descended from Henry VII, save Elizabeth herself and the captive Queen of Scots. Catherine had, however, another project, scarcely less chimerical, by which she hoped to secure the crown of the Plantagenets and Tudors to her own precious offspring. Not very easy, as she herself admits in the same letter to La Mothe, but still possible to be accomplished through his surpassing powers of persuasive eloquence. Her Majesty discloses this darling scheme in the following anxious query: Would she, Queen Elizabeth, have my son Alençon? As for him, he wishes it. He is turned of 16, though but little of his age. I deem she would make less difficulty of it if he were of stately growth, like his brethren, than I might hope somewhat, for he has the understanding, visage, and demeanour of one much older than he is, and as to his age, there are but 3 years between his brother and him. This doughty candidate for the hand of the greatest female sovereign the world had ever seen, was born in March 1555, consequently he was 22 years younger than Elizabeth, and his diminutive, mean figure, and prematurely old face were rendered more ridiculous by the fact that he had received the potent name of Hercules at the baptismal font, though at the death of his elder brother it had been judiciously changed for that of Francis. To make the case worse, he was scarred with the smallpox, his nose was so disproportionately large as to amount to deformity, and the conditions of his mind were as evil as those of his inconvenient little body. These circumstances were the more unpropitious, as Elizabeth was a decided admirer of beauty, and entertained the greatest antipathy to ugly and deformed people. She even carried her fastidiousness on this point to such an extreme, that she refused the place of a gentleman usher to an unexceptionable person for no other objection than the lack of one tooth, and whenever she went abroad, all ugly, deformed, and diseased persons were thrust out of her way, by certain officers whose business it was to preserve her majesty from the displeasure of looking on objects offensive to her taste. La Mothe Fenelon, who was aware of all her peculiarities, in his reply to Catharine, positively refused to insult Elizabeth by the offer of such a consort as the ugly urchin whom he was requested to recommend to her acceptance, and requested leave to return to France. He advised the queen mother withal to wait till the Duke of Alençon should have grown a little, before she caused him to be proposed to the Queen of England, or that princess would consider that it was done in mockery, and might possibly retaliate by some serious political injury. In reply to the evil reports alluded to by the Duke of Anjou, he affords the following noble testimonial of Elizabeth's character. They can write and speak very differently of this princess from the hearsay of men, who sometimes cannot forgive the great qualities of their betters. But in her own court they would see everything in good order, and she is there very greatly honoured, and understands her affairs so well, that the mightiest in her realm, and all ranks of her subjects, fear and revere her. And she rules them with full authority, which, I conceive, could scarcely proceed from a person of evil fame, and where there is a want of virtue. Nevertheless, I know what you have heard, and that there is an opinion that she will never have children. At the end of February, the importunities of Catherine de Medicis had wrung from Anjou a declaration that he was not only willing to wed Queen Elizabeth, but that he earnestly desired it. She wrote indefatigably with her own hand to forward the marriage, and gave the most earnest advice to Elizabeth to wed Anjou while he was in the mind. She exerted all her diplomatic skill in a dialogue she had with Lord Buckhurst, Queen Elizabeth's relative, and ambassador extraordinary at Paris. But to her infinite vexation she found him perfectly acquainted with the reluctance of the bridegroom, for his refrain to all her fine speeches was, "But why is Monsieur so unwilling?" On the return of Norris, her ambassador, to the court of France, Elizabeth questioned him very minutely as to the personal qualifications of Henry of Anjou, and received such a favourable description of his fine figure, handsome face, and graceful mien, that, conceiving a great wish to see him, she ordered Leicester to make a discreet arrangement for that purpose with La Mothe Fenelon, without committing her maidenly decency. The plan proposed was, for her to direct her progress toward the Kentish coast, and then, if her princely suitor wished to see her, he might cross the channel incognito by a morning tide, and return by the next tide, provided he had no inclination to remain longer, to cultivate the opportunity, thus condescendingly vouchsafed to him, of pleading his own cause. Unfortunately, Monsieur did not feel disposed to become the hero of the petite romance, which the royal coquette had taken the trouble of devising by way of enlivening the solemn dullness of a diplomatic courtship with a spice of reality. She had, from first to last, declared that nothing on earth should induce her to marry a prince whom she had never seen, and Henry of Anjou, though acknowledged to be one of the handsomest princes in Europe, perversely determined not to gratify her curiosity by exhibiting himself. Perhaps he had been alarmed at the well-meant but injudicious hint conveyed by Monsieur de la Mothe to his royal mother, that the queen's ladies had received instructions to watch him very diligently, in order to discover whether he evinced any genuine demonstrations of love for their mistress. A formidable ordeal, certainly, for any man to undergo who was expected to play the wooer to a royal spinster of Elizabeth's temper, and who was so many years his senior. Elizabeth, though disappointed of a personal interview of Monsieur, requested to see his portrait, and two were sent for her inspection by the queen mother. In her official instructions to Walsingham on the subject of the preliminary negotiations for her marriage with Anjou, Elisabeth expresses herself sincerely disposed to take a consort for the good of her realm, enlarging at the same time on her natural preference for a maiden life. She says: "In the beginning of our reign, it is not unknown how we had no disposition of our own nature to marry, no otherwise than it is manifestly known, that when the king, our dear father, reigned, and many times pressed us earnestly to marry, nor when in the late king, our brother's time, the like was renewed unto us, even for such as were then in real possession of kingdoms. When we lived but in a private state as a daughter or a sister to a king, yet could we never induce our mind to marry, but rather did satisfy ourself with a solitary life." Who the regal suitors were by whom the hand of Elisabeth was sought during her father's life might have been known to herself, but no historian or documentary evidence has ever recorded their names. Small, however, would have been the attention vouchsafed by Henry VIII to her reluctance to espouse any person on whom he might have felt disposed to bestow her in marriage. The evidences of history sufficiently prove that, from the time of her mother's first decline in the favour of the capricious tyrant, Henry, the young Elisabeth was at discount in the royal matrimonial market, and even the Earl of Arran neglected to secure her when offered as a bride for his son. The scene was changed, as she felt, when a kingdom became her portion, and her contempt for the interested motives of the numerous princely wooers by whom she was then surrounded was open and undisguised. But as the princes of the royal house of France were not marriageable till some point after her accession to the crown, she received the successive proposals of the three brothers with more civility than sincerity. She had a great political game to play, and in entertaining the matrimonial overtures from the court of France, she disarmed every direct hostile attempt that might otherwise have been made in favour of her royal prisoner, Mary Stuart. She directed Walsingham to say, in her name, that, considering the king is married, there can be no greater nor worthier offer made by the crown of France than Monsieur d'Anjou, and therefore we do thankfully accept it. On the terms of the marriage she bids him say, "that he thinks no less can be offered for conditions than was by the Emperor Charles with King Philip for Queen Mary." On the matter of religion, Walsingham was privately to inform the Queen Mother, that though she did not mean to put any force on the conscience of her son, yet she could not permit his exercising that form of religion in England which was prohibited by the laws of her realm, and that she should require his attendance upon her at such churches and oratories as she frequented. She adds, that she is content to have this matter kept secret for the present, meaning to make no one privy to it but such members of her council whom she most reasoned to trust, both for fidelity and secrecy, to wit, our cousin, the Earl of Leicester, of whom you may say whatsoever may be otherwise doubted, we find ready to allow of any marriage that we shall like, and with all marriages with any prince stranger, most of all this with the crown of France. The other is Sir William Cecil, Lord of Burleigh, and our principal secretary. This letter is given under the royal signet at Greenwich, the 24th of March, 1571. Walsingham, diplomatist though he was, candidly wrote to Burleigh, that this letter fairly perplexed him, but he thought it safest to follow the course prescribed by her majesty, whatever came of it. Meantime, the Earl of Morton, and others of his party, had arrived in England, to treat on the affairs of Scotland in the name of the infant King James. Queen Elizabeth, who was still amusing Mary and the court of France with deceptive negotiations for the restoration of that unfortunate princess to her liberty and her throne, required the rebel commissioners to declare the grounds on which they had deposed their queen. Instead of gratifying her, as she expected, with the repetition of all their frightful accusations against her hapless kinswoman, they favoured her majesty with a lengthy manifesto, setting forth that Scotland had from time immemorial been governed by male monarchs, and that they had the authority of Calvin to prove that magistrates had power to punish wicked sovereigns by imprisoning and depriving them of their realms, that they had shown their queen great favour in permitting her son to reign, and that she existed at that time only through the mercy of her people. Elizabeth could not listen with even a show of patience to sentiments so opposed to her notion of passive obedience and the divine right of kings. She told the deputies that they had not shown, nor could she perceive, any just cause for the manner in which they had troubled their queen, and advised them to seek other means for composing the discord then raging in Scotland. When Morton refused to agree to the articles of the treaty with Scotland, which had been proposed by the commissioners of Elisabeth, she told the 4 commissioners, who brought his answer to her, that she perceived in that answer the arrogance and hardness of a very obstinate heart, and that she knew that Morton himself had not brought such a one to her country, but that he had acquired it here from some of the members of her council, of whom she could well say, that they were worthy of being hanged at the gate of the castle, with a copy of their advice about their necks, and that it was not her will that Morton should stir from London, or his suite from her court, till some good conclusion had been made in this affair. On the 23rd of March, 1571, Queen Elizabeth held a council at Greenwich, at which the affairs of Mary Queen of Scots were debated in her presence, and the articles of the treaty, then on the tapis, caused such a fierce contention among these statesmen, that her majesty was compelled to interpose for the restoration of order. This she did in the very tone of old Henry, her father, by calling one of the assembly a fool, and another a madman. The French ambassador had been invited to attend this council, as a matter of courtesy to Mary's royal kindred in France, and entered just at the moment the discussion had reached this interesting climax. His arrival gave a different turn to the scene, for instead of proceeding with the subject, his excellency paid his compliments to the queen, and told her it was a long time since he had received news from France, and he came express this time to inquire of hers. She told him, with much satisfaction, that she could inform him that the public entry of their majesties of France had been made on the first Monday in March, and that her ambassador, Lord Buckhurst, had informed her that it was very magnificent, and also had written to her accounts of the combat at the barriers, and all the other feats that had been performed by the royal bridegroom, Charles IX., whose personal prowess he had greatly extolled, and had also praised Monseigneur, his brother, and that one of her equerries whom she had sent with Lord Buckhurst had already returned, and had affirmed that, without making comparisons between kings, for he had never seen any other besides his present majesty of France, it was impossible for any prince, lord or gentleman to go beyond him, or perform his part more gallantly, or with greater skill, in every sort of combat, whether on horse or foot, and that he related to her many particulars, all which had given her such pleasure to hear that she had made him repeat them several times, not without wishing that she had been present, as a third queen, to see it all herself, and that in truth she could willingly have reserved for herself the commission which she had given to Lord Buckhurst, to go and congratulate their most Christian majesties on their present felicity, adding, that she trusted, that by the blessing of God, that the most Christian queen would be happily cured of all her sickness in the course of the next 9 months. She then said, she had to solicit pardon for having sent a thief to Paris to steal a likeness of the queen, that she might enjoy the satisfaction of possessing her portrait. She drew it forth, as she spoke, from that capacious pocket, to which she was accustomed to consign the letters of foreign potentates and dispatches from her own ambassadors, with other diplomatic papers, and showing it to Monsieur de la Mothe, inquired if her most Christian majesty had as much embonpoint, and whether her complexion were as beautiful as the painter had represented. Before the interview concluded, La Mothe said, he was instructed to inquire how her majesty meant to proceed with respect to the Queen of Scotland. On which Elisabeth observed, that she had doubted whether he would allow the audience to end without naming the Queen of Scots to her, whom she could wish not to be quite so much in his master's remembrance, and still less in his. After this shrewd hint, she said, that she had used her utmost diligence to have the treaty perfected, and complained that the Cardinal of Lorraine had said and done various things against her, which Monsieur de la Mothe took some pains to explain, and the interview ended pleasantly on both sides. After an interval of 5 years, Elizabeth found it necessary to summon a new parliament to meet at Westminster, for the purpose of granting an enormous property tax, consisting of 2/10 and 2/15, and 1 subsidy by the laity, and 6 shillings in the pound by the clergy. The interference of Elizabeth in the continental wars, and the pensions she had paid for years, and continued to pay to the mercenary agitators in France, Scotland, and elsewhere, compelled her to inflict these grievous burdens on her own subjects. The spoils of the nobility and gentry who had taken part in the late risings in the north might have sufficed to pay the expenses of the armament employed to crush the insurrection, but the queen had been harassed by the importunities of a greedy set of self-interested counsellors and servants, who expected to be paid for their loyal adherence to her cause out of the forfeitures of their misguided neighbours. At the head of these bold beggars was her cousin, Lord Hunsdon, who, to use his own expression, was laudably anxious that her majesty's friends "may pike a sellet" from the spoils of the house of Percy. He and his sons made a good thing of the late revolt. Nothing tends more to establish despotism in sovereigns than the unsuccessful efforts of a faction to resist lawful authority. In consequence of the late rebellion, statutes were made for the security of the queen, which stretched the prerogatives of the crown beyond the limits to which the haughtiest of her predecessors had presumed to carry it, and the penalties against nonconformity assumed a character as inconsistent with the divine spirit of Christianity as the religious persecutions which had disgraced the preceding reign. In the very face of these arbitrary enactments, George Strickland, Esquire, one of the leaders of the Puritan party in the House of Commons, moved a reformation in the liturgy of the Church of England, and his motion was supported by those members professing the same opinions. The queen was highly offended at the presumption of Strickland in daring to touch on matters, over which she, as the head of the church, claimed supreme jurisdiction. But when this intimation was given to the Commons, Strickland and his party unanimously exclaimed, that the salvation of their souls was in question, to which all the kingdoms of the earth were nothing in comparison. Elizabeth, in a transport of indignation, summoned the uncompromising northern member before her and her council, and laid her personal commands upon him not to appear any more in the House of Commons. This arbitrary interference with the proceedings of the representatives of the great body of her subjects excited murmurs, both deep and loud in the House, which, for the first time, entered the lists with royalty, on the subject of violated privilege, and in defence of that palladium of English liberty, freedom of debate. They maintained, withal, the constitutional truth, that it was neither in the power of the sovereign to make laws singly, nor to violate those that were already established. Elizabeth had the wisdom to relinquish the struggle, and Strickland triumphantly resumed his place in the House, where he was received with shouts of congratulation. If we may trust the reports of La Mothe Fenelon, Elizabeth was heard to say, that she was tired of parliaments. None of her predecessors, she observed, had held more than 3 during their whole lives, while she already had had 4, and she had been so much tormented in the last about marrying, that she had resolved on 2 things. The first was, never to hold another parliament; the other, never to marry, and she meant to die in this resolution. But as concerned holding the parliament, it was easier to make that resolution than to abide by it. One of the statutes of this parliament rendered it penal, even to speak of any other successor to the crown of England than the issue of the reigning queen. Elizabeth's fastidious delicacy in refusing to have the word lawful annexed, as if it were possible that any other than legitimate children could be born of her, gave rise not only to unnecessary discussions on the subject, but some defamatory reports as to her motives for objecting to the customary word. I remember, says Camden, being then a young man, hearing it said openly by people, that this was done by the contrivance of Leicester, with a design to impose hereafter some base son of his own upon the nation, as the queen's offspring. In the preceding August, a Norfolk gentleman of the name of Marsham had actually been tried for saying, that my lord of Leicester had 2 children by the queen. and was condemned to lose both his ears, or else pay £100. Both punishments combined would have been a trifling mulct for the propagation of so injurious a scandal of a female sovereign. Early in April 1571, Signor Guido Cavalcanti arrived in England, bearing a joint letter from Charles IX. And Catherine de Medicis, addressed to Queen Elizabeth, in which a formal tender of the Duke of Anjou's hand was made to her. Cavalcanti was stopped at Dover by order of the Queen, and conducted under a guard to the house of Lord Burleigh in London, where she had a secret interview with him, on the subject of his mission, before he was permitted to see the French ambassador, to whom the office of delivering the royal letter to her Majesty was assigned by his own court. The next day, April 12th, La Mothe Fenelon obtained an audience of her Majesty, who received him in a retired part of her gallery, and, after a few observations had been exchanged on other subjects, he made the proposal in due form, and delivered to her the letter from the King and Queen Mother of France. She received it, according to Fenelon, with evident satisfaction, and replied modestly, but expressed herself so desirous of the accomplishment of the marriage, that he was fully convinced of her sincerity. She referred him to Leicester and Burleigh as the chosen counsellors by whom the conditions of the marriage were to be arranged on her part. The limits of this work will not admit the insertion of the official correspondence on the preliminaries of this marriage that was exchanged on the part of their Majesties of France and Queen Elizabeth, but it is among the richest documentary specimens of deceit. The state papers of France abound in professions of the true love and esteem which impelled Charles and Catherine to solicit the hand of the Queen of England for their devoted servant Monsieur, together with a few apologies for not having come to a positive declaration sooner. Having been informed that her Majesty was determined never to take a consort, and that she was accustomed to deride and mock every one who pretended to her hand, which had deterred their most Christian Majesties from preferring the suit of their said son and brother, and had made Monsieur very sad and sore at heart. Elisabeth, in her reply, gravely defended herself from the charge of ever having mocked or trifled with any of the princely candidates for her hand. She availed herself at the same time of the opportunity of enumerating a few of the most considerable of those. When the King of Spain first proposed to her, she said, she immediately excused herself on a scruple of conscience, which would not permit her to espouse one who had been her sister's husband, and as to the princes of Sweden and Denmark, she had within 8 days replied to them, that she had no inclination then to marry, so that they had no occasion to wait, and as for the proposal of the King Charles IX., which was made when he was very young, she had also done all that was proper to let him understand her mind. The Archduke, she must confess, had been kept longer in suspense, because of the troubles and hindrances that were happening in the world, but it might nevertheless be seen that she had used no deceit towards him. She artfully hinted, with regard to Scotland, that when Monsieur should be her lord and husband, the prosperity and peace of England would be his concern no less than hers, and he would see that the dangers, caused by the intrigues of the Queen of Scots, would be more easy to parry while she was in her care, than if she were at large. Section 23.